Every fantasy football championship winning team has a little bit of risk associated with it. To win in fantasy football, you have to be willing to risk it. But sometimes going above and beyond can get you into trouble. Some risk is okay. Too much risk, you definitely don't want to deal with that. So today, we're going to take a look at some of the riskiest running backs heading into 2024. Yo, what is going on, Headliner Nation? Welcome back into the Fantasy Headliners. Today's video, I'm going to be diving into the top 24 running backs based on their current ADP. And we're going to take a look back to last season, and we're going to see just how risky some of them were. And there is going to be some information in this video that is going to shock you. But the one thing that won't shock you is when you win a fantasy football championship at the end of 2024 because you bought our 2024 fantasy football draft guide. It is the best bang for your buck fantasy product available in the industry today that you can access digitally from wherever you want to. And the best part is we will continue to update it periodically until football kicks off in week 1. Literally everything that you could think of that you would need, plus exclusive tools to be successful in fantasy football this season. And it's only $21.99. There's a link down in the description below. Head on over to our website, get your draft guide right now so you can start prepping for your drafts regardless of when they happen. All right, let me provide a quick explanation on how this video is going to work and the information that you're going to be getting. I've taken the top 24 running backs based on their current ADP, and I took a look at where they finished each individual week of the 2023 season. I documented how many times they finished as a top 12 running back, as a top 24 running back, as a top 36 running back, and how many weeks they finished outside of the top 36. And then I assign points based on where you finished. If you finished as an RB1, you get 1 point. If you finish as an RB2, you get 2 points. If you finish as an RB3, you get 3 points. And if you finish outside the top 36, that's 5 points. Then I take those total points and I divide them by the amount of games that were played last season. The lower the score, the less risky the player was. And we're gonna take a look at each category real quick to see who had the most games as an RB1, RB2, RB3, and who finished outside the top 36 the most. Then we'll take a look at the final score and we'll talk about each individual running back. It is literally no shock to anybody that Christian McCaffrey had the most RB1 games last season with 13. Kyren Williams finished second overall with 9 games as an RB1 last season. But then tied at 8 right behind Kyren Williams was Travis Etienne and Derrick Henry. He was a little volatile last season, and we're going to be able to take a look at that score in just a minute. But he did end up finishing as an RB1 plenty last season, and that was on a really bad team that offensively could not stay consistent at any point in time. Just imagine what this year's numbers may look like. Now, at the bottom of this list is Zamir White with only 1 RB1 performance last season. But he might be a little bit of a different scenario, and we're going to talk more in depth about him at the end of the video. For RB2 finishes last season, David Montgomery led the way with 7. And it really bodes well to what we're talking about this year with David Montgomery. Maybe he doesn't have as much upside as Jahmyr Gibbs, but given the offense that he plays in and his skill set, he should still be a really safe RB2 on your team. But how about Joe Mixon right behind David Montgomery? 6 RB2 finishes last year. He never really gave you a ton of upside, but we said it time and time again last season. The dude just kept giving you fantasy points. It wasn't a ton of fantasy points. He wasn't winning you weeks, but he certainly wasn't losing those weeks for you either. And then Alvin Kamara finished tied with him, also with 6 RB2 performances. Really propped up by all of that receiving work. And for as consistent as David Montgomery was, Jahmyr Gibbs was a little bit more up and down. As you can see, only 1 RB2 finish this past year. He had a handful of RB1 finishes, he had that 1 RB2 finish, and then RB3 finishes after that. 6 RB3 finishes for Breece Hall, which may seem as a little bit of a shock to you all, because He was so good to end the season, and some of that recency bias just kind of creeps up about how good he was at the end of the year, and you kind of forget about a lot of those unsteady performances to begin the season. Now, I'll take 6 RB3 finishes over 6 finishes outside the top 36. It may not be that much of a difference in points, but at least that means they were probably a flex option at that point if they finished as an RB3. Again, Joe Mixon, 5 finishes as an RB3. Not a whole lot of upside, but consistently giving you those fantasy points. But DeAndre Swift finished tied with Joe Mixon for 5 finishes as an RB3 as well. And a lot of DeAndre Swift truthers saw the beginning of his tenure in Philadelphia last season and were excited about it because he ripped off some RB1 performances. But after those games, really, he just didn't give you the type of upside you were hoping for. And that's kind of the difference between Joe Mixon and DeAndre Swift last season. It felt like with Joe Mixon, we understood. We weren't sitting around waiting for a bunch of high-end RB1 performances. He was giving us RB2 and RB3 performances, and if we got RB1, that was fine. But with DeAndre Swift, people were sitting around waiting for those games every single week. It really felt like people were like, hey, DeAndre Swift has all of this upside. He's gonna hit it this week. He's got RB1 potential, and he just would never get there. How about Christian McCaffrey? No RB3 performances, and we'll talk about his performances outside the top 12 in just a second. But if you're doing the addition in your head, you already saw 16 games talked about between the RB1 and RB2 columns. Christian McCaffrey last season did not give you one performance that was below RB2 status. Last season was actually insane for Christian McCaffrey. All right, now we're gonna talk about the running backs that had the most finishes outside the top 36 RBs. These were the games that killed you. These were the games where very few points were scored and you lost because of these games. Now, Zamir White led the pack with 10 games outside the top 36, but I don't think it's fair to judge Zamir White on all 10 of those games. And again, we're going to talk about him a little bit more in depth here in just a minute. So if you want to hear more about Zamir White, wait until we talk about the final scores. Now, this is where some early season struggles got guys like Najee Harris, David Montgomery, James Cook, Ramondre Stevenson, especially Ramondre Stevenson, where at the beginning of the season, they just weren't clicking on all cylinders. For Derrick Henry, it was a little bit more about his inconsistency throughout the entire year and the offense that he played in. Najee Harris had a lot to do with Jaylen Warren. That was definitely a big concern. But for guys like James Cook and Ramondre Stevenson, they were just kind of slow at times. James Cook did have some big games, maybe a little bit later in the year, but then went downhill again. Ramondre Stevenson started really slow. Then he picked up and started to give you some really nice performances, and then he got hurt and missed the rest of the season. But it's extremely important to note, not only the guys that gave you a ton of games outside the top 36, but the guys that didn't finish outside the top 36 as often. There are only 3 players inside the current top 24 ADP that did not finish with a game outside the top 36 last season. Christian McCaffrey is no shock to you. Kyren Williams may not be a shock to you. Joe Mixon is the 3rd one. And his situation, in my opinion, has improved at this point, and Houston definitely wanted Joe Mixon in their uniform. I think Joe Mixon is in for a pretty darn good year. All right, now it's time to dissect the final score in each individual running back, and let's start with the guys who were the least risky last season. Again, Christian McCaffrey is up there, and there's not really a whole lot that I need to say about him. He was absolutely excellent last season. Kyren Williams feels like he's being disrespected a little bit this year. Last season, not only did he provide a ton of efficiency, but a ton of volume as well. I love Blake Corum, but he is not going to ruin Kyren Williams' fantasy value. And these numbers right here should convince you that he still needs to be invested in. Tied with an overall score of 2 are Joe Mixon and David Montgomery, 2 of the least riskiest running backs last season. David Montgomery, in part to how many times he finished, is a top 24 running back. Joe Mixon, in part because he didn't finish outside the top 36 even one time last season. Both of these guys are in really good spots in 2024, and both of them aren't costing a premium top 12 draft pick either. I like both of these guys to be absolute solid fantasy contributors for you once again in 2024. How about Jonathan Taylor finishing with a final score of 2.11? Now, he only had 9 games last season, but in those 9 games, he was absolutely solid the entire time and provided your fantasy team with a lot of stability. It's the instability and being on the field that's the issue for Jonathan Taylor, not when he's on the field. And if he can finish 2024 with 17 healthy games, he should be right back here once again. Bijan Robinson and Rachaad White tied with a 2.18 final score. And people are going to look at Bijan Robinson and think there is no way he finished this high. But he did. The biggest issue with Bijan Robinson last year is he didn't fulfill your first round ADP. That's the big issue. It's almost like if you would have drafted Joe Mixon in the first round last year. The performances he gave you for his ADP were just fine, but the performances that he gave you would not have lived up to a first round ADP. The same thing goes for Bijan Robinson. If you had drafted Bijan Robinson in like the 4th round, the performances he gave you, you would have been just fine with it. Probably still a little frustrated, but you would have been fine. The reason we were so upset about Bijan Robinson, though, is because he was drafted in the 1st round, and he didn't return that type of value. Rachaad White last season absolutely was one of the least riskiest running backs to use, especially a little bit later in the season. But the problem with Rachaad White is that he was getting all the volume in the world, tied for Christian McCaffrey in touches, but he was awful when it came to his efficiency. If we were doing a different type of breakdown right now, and you looked at volume, Rachaad White absolutely belongs with all these running backs. But if you talked about efficiency, Rachaad White would actually be down in the red running backs right now. Rachaad White, he's going to need a lot of volume this year, but David Canales is no longer in Tampa Bay, and we'll see if the new OC is willing to use him that much. All right, the second tier of running backs here start with Jahmyr Gibbs and Isaiah Pacheco. And Jahmyr Gibbs was really brought down by the fact that he wasn't utilized very much to begin the season. After he came back from his injury, the dude was unstoppable. He had a couple of weeks that definitely weren't great finishes, but the guy was a consistent top 10 finisher for a majority of the rest of the year. It will be really interesting to see how his numbers look next year after he gets a full year of usage in 2024. And Isaiah Pacheco tying with Jahmyr Gibbs has to make you feel really good about him. Pacheco is being drafted in like the 3rd round right now. Jahmyr Gibbs is a borderline round 1 pick. Now, Pacheco probably could make his way into round 2 potentially at some point as well, but Pacheco brings a little bit more stability in terms of his floor, but not nearly as much upside as Jahmyr Gibbs. But Jahmyr Gibbs gives you the upside that warrants drafting him in the 1st round. While Pacheco, this score shows us that, hey, if we take him a couple of rounds later, the risk won't be there for him, and we actually will be happy with that ADP. Alvin Kamara, a lot like Rachaad White, propped up by a ton of volume, but the problem was it wasn't nearly as much volume as Rachaad White. Alvin Kamara last season had by far his worst efficiency season that we've seen as a pro, but it's been slowly trending down over the last couple of years. I've got a lot of concerns about Alvin Kamara. Travis Etienne being down here isn't super shocking either, especially a little bit later in the season after he got banged up and just wasn't playing as well as he did to begin the year. James Conner finishing at the tail end of the B tier is not all that shocking. He definitely had quite a bit of performance inside the top 12. The issue with James Conner was the fact that he didn't have a ton of RB2 performances, only 1 last season. The rest of his performances came just inside the top 36 or just outside of it. And unfortunately, that brought that risk score down a little bit more. All right, heading on down to the C tier, there are a couple of running backs at the very beginning that a lot of people feel like won't fit this criteria next year. Saquon Barkley and Breece Hall. Saquon Barkley is going to be on a much better team, and I have shared some concerns about his potential upside, but that doesn't mean that I don't think that he's going to be a very safe running back. He'll definitely get a lot of touches in a very good offense, and even if he misses out on some touchdowns and some passing game work, his floor should be good all season long. And with Breece Hall, I don't think we're going to have to worry about him disappearing for weeks at a time like he did last season. At the end of the year, dude was super solid. That knee injury that he came back from, a thing of the past. And now he's going to be getting Aaron Rodgers back, which should make the Jets offense way more consistent, which will make Breece Hall far less risky. Kenneth Walker, unfortunately, is hurt by a couple of games where he ended up not finishing them. If he had finished those games and played well, his risk score probably would have been up in the B tier. Health is always the biggest concern when it comes to Kenneth Walker. He does have a lot of really good upside every single week. And if he can stay more consistent with that upside in 2024, which I think he will, he could be a far less risky running back last season, again, as long as he stays healthy. Josh Jacobs, unfortunately, didn't play much last season. In the few games that he did play, he did have a few good performances that helped kept his score down. But realistically, last season is not the same Josh Jacobs that we'll see in 2024. This year, he should be way more consistent. And Derrick Henry and Devon Chan being tied absolutely is something to keep an eye on. There's a lot of people this season who are hyping up Devon Chan, but they're staying away from Derrick Henry. We can't do that, ladies and gentlemen. These guys carried the same risk factor last season. So it's crazy to think, based on what people feel like a Chan's upside is making him a pick that's going 3 or 4 spots ahead of Derrick Henry. I'm still buying into Derrick Henry and the Baltimore offense way more than I'm going to buy into Devon Chan and him actually staying healthy. All right, now we're going to take a look at the riskiest running backs last season. James Cook is going to lead it off, and really, it was about consistent usage for him. The Buffalo offensive game plan last year just didn't include James Cook as much as we would have liked it to. They tried to get him involved, but those consistent touches on the ground just weren't there. DeAndre Swift, in that offense last season, there's no reason that he shouldn't have been less risky than what he was, and that's one of the reasons why I'm fading DeAndre Swift this year. I don't think there's any way that I can invest in a guy in the Chicago Bears offense that couldn't take better advantage of the Philadelphia Eagles offense. Aaron Jones, absolutely, his injury was a part of it. He had some huge games, he was injured, and then he had some stinkers as well. In Minnesota this year, probably could end up seeing some inconsistencies as well, and may carry a nice risk factor this year too, knowing the fact that Ty Chandler will probably cut into his touches a little bit more than A.J. Dillon did in Green Bay. Ramondre Stevenson, it was the offense around him in the start of the year. Those final 4 or 5 games that he played right before he got hurt, he was starting to bump himself up a little bit, but unfortunately it wasn't enough to overcome so many poor performances to begin the year. Najee Harris finishing this low on the risk factor really leads me to continue wanting to buy into Jaylen Warren instead. Maybe Najee Harris has a little bit better of a floor than what Jaylen Warren does, but Jaylen Warren has so much more upside than Najee Harris. I just can't find myself investing in Najee Harris knowing that, yeah, based on his volume, maybe he's a safe RB2, but if Jaylen Warren gets hot in any given game, it drops Najee Harris all the way down to probably being outside the top 36. Jaylen Warren is so efficient that even if he doesn't get as many touches as Najee Harris, he definitely could carry a much better floor. And Zamir White is at the very bottom of this list, and I don't think it's fair to stick him with the 4.23 score that he has here, because once again, to begin the season, Zamir White wasn't even utilized. I'm talking like a few special team snaps, and then he sat on the sidelines more than he was out on the field. He was not used. So I decided to take a look at the last 4 games of the season instead. His risk score over the last 4 games of the season was only a 2.5. Now, that would have put him up tied with Derrick Henry and Devon Chan, which I really feel like going into this season needs to be considered a little bit more. Yeah, he had some good finishes to end the year, but not necessarily enough to get me on board with him being like a really safe RB2. His scoring this year puts him kind of in that risk factor of Devon Chan for me this year. Chan is a little bit more of a risk because of the teammates around him and his injury factor, whereas Zamir White, I'm just not going to buy into only 4 games of decent production last season. Yo, Headliner Nation, we're going to spend the rest of the week talking about the riskiest players at all the other positions as well. This has become a staple of our off-season content, so hopefully y'all are still loving it. Hit the like button to let me know that you appreciate it. And in the comments down below, let me know, who do you think had a bad risk score last season, but will have a much safer risk score when we run the numbers again next year? But for now, Headliner Nation, I'm gonna pop on out of here. Make sure you subscribe to the channel. Make sure you like the video. Make sure you turn on the bell notifications. And YouTube is gonna recommend one of our last videos to you right now. If you missed it, check it out. Peace out, Headliner Nation. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll catch you on the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.